Today we're doing it. Let's do a quick and dirty survey of some of the most important interpretive issues in the Abraham story, specifically Genesis 12 through 17, and in chapters 21 and 22. In chapter 12, Abram, later to become Abraham, I'll probably just call him Abraham in this video. Abram is hanging out in Mesopotamia in Ur by the Euphrates River, and God appears to him and says, look, I want you to go to this new land I'm going to give you, and establishes the first framework for what we refer to as the Abrahamic covenant. Now, right here in the first paragraph, you'll see that the three main parts of the Abrahamic covenant are already present. That God promises to give Abraham land, and that God promises to give Abraham descendants and to create a great nation through his offspring, and blessing. Not only blessing for Abraham, but also blessing for those who are blessed by Abraham. So we see Abraham traveling by stages from Mesopotamia to the Promised Land. And the way that I want to read this is in the context of the Babylonian exile, as we've been doing. There are other ways to read this passage, but think about how the Abrahamic covenant narrative would have read to those Judean exiles in Babylon, in the Babylonian exile. The idea that Abraham is in Mesopotamia, God calls him, he is obedient to God, and then is given the land and is turned into a great nation. Here is this group of exiles waiting to hear God call them again from exile and bring them to the Promised Land. Once Abraham is in the Promised Land, then he has to go to Egypt because of a famine and then come back into the Promised Land enriched, which is a preview of what's going to happen to the later Exodus generation. That, again, very powerful to those exiles who are thinking about the land as a theological place. The land is the place of the promise, the place where we are a nation, the place where God blesses us. And here we are now outside the land, like Abraham was, like the Exodus community was, and we are waiting for God to bring us back into the land. So when we read all of these Torah narratives over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to come back to this notion of exilic context for interpreting the particular narrative movements back and forth, especially with regard to these Abrahamic ideas of land and nation and blessing. Now, also, when we read these stories, I want to pay attention to characterization. We're going to look at them from the perspective of the narrative storytelling. And these narratives, as we've seen in some other passages, do not provide the kind of detail that we often would like. They leave out a lot of information. They leave out some of the motivations, some of the internal dialogue, the feelings, the emotions, the perspectives of individual characters. It just says A did this, and then B did that, and then A did this, and then B did that, and then C happened. The stories don't include the moral of the story. It's not a clear pedagogical or theological story. So we're left filling in the gaps, as we have seen with passages in the past. The term that we might use for this is elliptical, that the narrative storytelling technique leaves little holes, leaves little gaps where we can't see in the story answers to the questions that we have. And that's especially true of characterization. So, for example, in the Abraham story, especially with regards to Sarah and Hagar, who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? The fact is that these are very complicated, nuanced presentations of people doing things, and there isn't a good guy, really. There isn't a bad guy. Now, Abraham, his father Abraham, had many sons of Father Abraham. You are one of them, and so am I. So let's all praise the Lord. Am I right? Well, when you read these narratives, I hope that you read them closely enough to call into question a little bit that valorization of Abraham as a character, Father Abraham, the saint of the tradition because he does some things that are not great. For example, in chapter 12, after they get into the promised land, immediately, the very next paragraph, there's a famine, so they have to go to Egypt. And on the way to Egypt, Abram says to Sarah, tell the Pharaoh that you are my sister because they're going to want you and they're going to kill me. And so you say you're my sister so that it may go well with me and that my life may be spared on your account. Well, they get there. He tells everybody Sarah's his sister. Sarah takes Pharaoh into his house. She becomes a member of his harem. And then Abraham is being enriched because of Sarah's connection with the Pharaoh. But then later there are plagues which tip off Pharaoh somehow. We don't know exactly how Pharaoh figured out through some divination what's the reason for this is. And so that he calls Abram and he says, well, that was a really terrible thing to do. Why did you say she's my sister? Now, take her. Here's your wife. Be gone. And he leaves. And, this is, I think, problematic. So you have a story about the patriarch Abraham who responds in faith and is given the land and everything is great, is triumphal. But then immediately shows this lack of faith. He immediately shows this fear about the situation, which leads him to make a selfish decision, a fearful decision, and he puts his wife into danger. This is the first also of a motif in Genesis called the endangered ancestress, where in order for Abraham to become the father of a great nation, he's got to have kids, and things keep happening that endanger that promise, including giving your wife to Pharaoh. That would be one of those things that would prevent you from having children. Other things happen, especially around the theme of infertility. Well, it's also true that Abraham later does the same trick with Abimelech, king of Gerar, and then later Abraham's son does the same thing with Rebekah, also to Abimelech, king of Gerar. So there are three total stories in which the ancestor passes off his wife as a sister, some kind of multiplication of the tradition maybe, but altogether, I think, indicate that the ancestors themselves, not that great, not really upstanding in terms of how they deal with their wives and their families, and especially how they express faith in God and integrity in their dealings with other people. You see this famously in chapter 16. I'm going to skip that for now. In chapter 16, this is the theme of infertility that I mentioned. So Sarah gets this idea. She says, look, I have this slave named Hagar, and I want Abraham, you go and have sex with my slave. And then by that means we will get a child and I will have a son by her. Now, the thing that we don't see here is any kind of conversation, any kind of perspective from Abraham, any idea of how Sarah feels about this or how Abraham feels about this, or, God forbid, how Hagar feels about this. So when she says this, is she like, hey, I got an idea, try this? And he's like, okay, sure. Or is she, well, why don't you just go do this? And he's like, fine, I'll do it. Or is she, I don't know, we could do this. And he's like, I don't know, maybe we'll try that. Right? Those are three very different ways of reading this passage. And so, I don't know, you have to choose how you want to see it. It seems to me that Sarah's in a tight spot. Sarah is desperate because in a patriarchal society, she needs sons. She needs them. And Abraham, not as much. But he's willing to go have sex with Hagar. Maybe that's an old story. So, at any rate, what happens is he does go have sex with Hagar, the slave of Sarah. Don't call her her servant. She's her slave. So he went into Hagar. That's one of the idioms for have sex with. And she got pregnant and had a boy. And then when she saw that she was pregnant, it says that she looked with contempt on her mistress. And then Sarah says to Abram, how dare you? You did this to me. So may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave you this girl, and then now she's gotten pregnant. She's looking on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me, as if Abraham has done this thing to Sarah. Now, both of them are doing something to Hagar, but the story is interested primarily in the relationship here between Abram and Sarah, his wife. So who's the good guy? Is Abraham the good guy? No, I don't think so. Sarah, Hagar, but she is looking with contempt on her mistress. The way I read this story, not just me, but the way I think is helpful to read this story is to see that Sarah and Hagar are together under the control of a patriarchal system in which the way that they are able to preserve their life and well-being is by having male children. Now, Hagar begins as a slave. She's in a bad position already. But the two of them together are caught in this patriarchal system. This puts them at odds. This turns them into competitors with each other, against each other, for the limited spoils that are given out to women in a patriarchal system. And so it's understandable, I think, that Hagar sees this as her opportunity to move up. And it's understandable that Sarah sees this as a threat. And it's understandable that Sarah is so eager to have a child that she's willing to go through this very abusive kind of relationship here with Hagar. It doesn't excuse the things that they do. But I think that this text makes a lot more sense, that motivations behind what Sarah does and what Hagar does makes more sense once you have a clear understanding of the patriarchal context in which the thing that is valued is male children who are heirs to their male fathers, and that the role of a woman is to produce male heirs, that the sexuality of a woman belongs to her father until it is sold to her husband, and her job is to have a male baby. That's her job. And if that's not happening, as happens in several stories in Genesis, then that creates a threat to the long-term well-being of that woman. So Abram says to her, and now this is another example of Abram's weakness, well, you do what you want to do. She's your slave. Take it, send her out. Now, she's pregnant with his baby, but he just hands off. Hey, do what you want. She's yours. So Sarah then abuses her, deals harshly with her. Again, we don't know exactly what that looks like. I would translate it abuses her, and then she runs away. I'm going to come back to this in a second. In chapter 21, you see the second half of this story. In the interim, Sarah does get pregnant and has a boy named Isaac. And when he's 8 days old, they're having a party, and everybody's having fun. And Sarah says, when God has brought laughter for me, everyone who hears will laugh with me. That's a kind of etymology for the son, the name of Isaac. The child is growing and is weaned, and Abraham, now he's now officially Abraham, makes a great feast on the day that he is weaned. Now, look at this. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. I should have mentioned, when she runs out into the desert, God appears to her and sends her back. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So now she's living with Abraham. She's had her child, a boy, whose name is Ishmael. She sees Ishmael playing with Isaac. Now, tzachak is the verb here. That's the same verb as laughing and laughter in the previous paragraph. That's the same verb that's behind the name of Isaac. So she looks out and she sees Ishmael tzachaking with her son, Yitzhak, Isaac. And she interprets this as a threat in some way. Now, other translations do not translate this in a positive way, playing with. They might say teasing or sporting with, or, the idea is that he is in somehow tormenting Isaac. And therefore, she sees this as a threat. This kid's being mean to my son. We got to deal with this situation. I see tzachak in the same way that the NRSV translators here have done it, which is that he's playing with Isaac. He's sporting. They're having a good time, frolicking with Isaac. But she sees it as a threat. And the reason why it's a threat is because Ishmael is the oldest son of Abraham. Now, she's the main wife. Hagar is still a slave, but there is ambiguity here. What's going to happen when Abraham dies? When Abraham dies and Ishmael is around, will Ishmael become the patriarch? And if that happens, what kind of possible future is there for Sarah or for her son, Isaac? Or is there going to be conflict? Is there going to be war between Ishmael and Isaac? The boy, in her mind, is a threat. Now, I think it's a sad moment. This is one of the sadder moments in the story. This little tiny moment. And it's a throwaway line in the story, as most of them are. But what if somehow she had seen Ishmael and had reached out? If somehow a relationship could have been formed and things could have been better. But instead she looked out and what she saw was a threat. She saw a competitor. I think there's a lot of lesson here for how we deal with each other and how we think about outsiders in our community. So Abraham is like, I don't know what to do about this. And God says to Abraham, fine, send the boy out. It's going to be okay. So Abraham gets up early in the morning. He gets bread and water, gives it to Hagar and her child, and then he sends her away. And then she's out wandering. So it's a sad story. It's important to point out, however, that both Hagar and Ishmael are very important in the tradition. Ishmael is the child of the promise traced through Islam. So he's a very important figure in the Quran. Hagar has taken on a signal importance, especially in womanist interpretation. And you can read about Hagar in our Alice Ogden Bellis book that's assigned for this week. That, if you have it in this Corona quarantine, but the womanists have lifted up the story of Hagar in an interesting way because she, in chapter 16, when she's in the wilderness, God appears to her and tells her to go back to Abraham, and then gives her a kind of blessing and pronounces a kind of blessing on her son Ishmael. Now, it says he's going to be a wild ass of a man, but this is God laying out a plan for her son. And then she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roy," for she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore, the well is called Be'er Lachai Roy, which is the well of seeing God. She's the only person in the Bible who gives God a name. And so the figure of Hagar, the character of Hagar, has a kind of audacity, a kind of aggressive purpose that you really don't see with other characters, including male characters. And so Hagar has taken on a really importance in the history of interpretation, especially around feminist and womanist interpretation. So I would commend that to you. That might be a good topic for your second paper if you're looking for one. Now, I'm going to turn quickly, before this video gets too long, to the story in Genesis 22, which is the story of the binding of Isaac. This is the very next thing that happens. Finally, Abraham has a son. Finally, Ishmael has been sent away, taken care of. Okay, fine. Then God says to Abraham, I want you to kill your son. Take him to this place I'm going to show you, and I want you to burn him on the burnt offering, burn him on the altar as a burnt offering. And Abraham's like, okay, great. I've often thought that this would be the end of my career as a patriarch if this was required. But Abraham is ready to go. Now, in the end, as you know, God doesn't make him do it. But how do we feel about this? Does Abraham know that he's not going to have to do it? Or does he believe he is going to have to do it and is prepared to do it? Or does he think he's going to have to do it, but he's hoping to change God's mind? We do see him earlier in a passage we're going to talk about on Monday, arguing with God about Sodom. He intervenes with God, calling God's justice into question to try to save Sodom, a place of wickedness. But here he says nothing. He doesn't try to save the life of his son in this passage. He's just like, okay, fine, let's go. So I think there are questions here. Well, as they're going, the story slows down. Isaac questions, wait, where's the lamb? And Abram says, God will provide the lamb, right? Is he thinking to himself, God's going to, in the end, not make me do it? Or is he just telling Isaac something to make him be quiet? And I've heard that fathers will sometimes do that. So when they get there, the action slows way down. He bound his son Isaac. There's so many verbs here, just really slow click, click, click kind of narrative structure. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar. He reached out his hand. He took the knife to kill his son, right? It's tension. And then, whoa, the angel of the Lord calls and says, Abraham, Abraham. And he's like, Hineni, don't do it. Look, there's a ram. How do we imagine this story? Is Abraham holding the knife going, okay, God, now's the time. Let's do it. Or is he like, let's go, right? Is the voice of the angel or the angel like restraining Abraham because he's about to kill his son? Or is he slowly stalling for time, very reluctant? Is he crying? Is he grim? What's the kid doing? Now, when you read this story, it sounds like the boy is little, like 10, maybe 12, I don't know. Small enough to be a little boy who's carrying some wood. So he's not real little. He's carrying some wood, but he can be put on an altar and tied down. He's little. I always think of him about 10 years old or so. If you read the genealogies and add up all the dates, he's a grown man. So again, how do you imagine the story? Is he a little boy being tied down by his father? Is he a grown man willingly submitting to this? This is how the story becomes a figuring in Christian interpretation for Jesus, the idea of this grown man, the son, who is willingly submitting to being killed. God did not make Abraham do it, but later he did it to his own son, right? That's the kind of Christian interpretation that you see. It's a problematic story. We might read this story as a story about the cessation of human sacrifice, that previously it was allowed or required and now it's no longer required. That's one way that the story has been read. I see it as a story about the endangered promise, because if Isaac is killed here, now we're back to square one. I see it as one of these really conflicted stories about Abraham and the character of Abraham, and like, how much do we really know about how Abraham is thinking or feeling in the middle of all of this? Now, one of the things that I always do with this passage, come back to that in a second, is look at coloring pages. There are a remarkable variety of coloring pages devoted to the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. So imagine you send your kid to Sunday school, and they're coloring, as they often do, their first grade Sunday school, and they come back and they show you the coloring drawing they did, and they're like, hey, look, here's what we did. And it's this image. Is that troubling to anyone? Let's look at a couple of others. He looks already dead in this one to me. But is he passed out? He's tied down with these little ropes. I've arranged these where I can sort of tell the story. So here is God pointing to the altar, telling Isaac to get up on it. Here he is, tied on the altar, tied down. Abraham is over him with a knife. What's he going to do? He raises the knife. The child is tied. He's passed out. The knife is getting ready to plunge. Here it comes, and then the angel grabs him and stops him. This one, I think, if you colored it properly, could be the cover of a heavy metal album. And then they see the ram caught in a thicket, and everybody's happy. Is this troublesome to anybody? This is from a website called ministrytochildren.com. Ministrytochildren.com. It's an example, I think, of our theological framework, which wants to see this as a story of God's mercy, right? And also prefiguring the death of Jesus, trying to turn it into something positive. But you've got an image of a father tying up and getting ready to stab his little boy, and you're giving it to children saying, here, let's color this. Let's learn this Bible story. So similar to the flood discussion we had, I think there's some real difficulties in the way Christians relate to these stories that we need to discuss. I mean, look how happy he is here. Like, I don't know that he's going to be that happy that quick. This one I thought was interesting because it shows Isaac as a man, like you see in some interpretations. My favorite rendering of this is the Sacrifice of Isaac by Caravaggio, 1602, I think. This is my favorite one. You can see I'll put a link to the full-size image in the description. You should click on it because you can see the thumb pressing down into Isaac's cheek and just the blood flowing away from his thumb. You can see this area right here where the angel is physically restraining Abraham. The skin is wrinkling up and his muscles are tight. Like this is a man getting ready to stab his child, and the angel is physically restraining him. So I think you'll agree that we've got some interesting passages here. Stories of Abraham showing faith, stories of Abraham showing lack of faith, stories of Abraham being shallow, selfish, avoiding responsibility, but also sometimes stepping right up and doing the hard thing. What does God want? Why are all these things happening? What is God's plan through all of this? Right? These are all real questions. And I think they also resonate with that exile community. These stories have a kind of ambiguity and a kind of tension and a kind of engaging quality that would have been very resonant with an exile community asking themselves those questions. What does it mean to be faithful? What does God require? What is God's plan in the midst of all of this? How should we feel about these events that we're experiencing? And ultimately, how is God working through broken people, weak people, screwed up circumstances, terrible situations in order to advance the covenant, in order to preserve the promise that was made, moving it toward completion, moving it toward fulfillment. That is a theme in Genesis. That is a theme that resonates very strongly with an exile community.